I'll talk about big data and I'll I like to, in a way, throw away some thoughts for which actually I would be really glad to have some feedback in terms of what people have experienced and how they look at this field and how that's really changing how we do science and engineering now and in the future. A lot of this work comes out of the experience in the last few years. I used to be at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and then after moving to Utah, I established this center, and it was really focused on, since I've been already involved in dealing with large data, the integration of techniques in data management, analysis, and visualization was one of the key aspects that I felt would be important to really do effective work. But this level of integration is really much broader than just these three areas. So first of all, kind of a formal definition of what's big data, so we know what we're talking about. So big data is like teenage sex. Everybody talks about it. Nobody really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everybody else is doing it. So everybody claims they are doing it. So this is actually a quote from Dan Ariely. So professor actually in behavioral economics, very good way of putting things. My positive outlook is that eventually everybody will do it. And I think this is really true for big data, is that lots of us, one way or the other, are starting dealing with large data. And in many cases, over and over, you start dealing with problems where the size of the data can be a big, either challenging in dealing with that, or kind of a way to a solution to dealing with more information and so on. So some examples are work like this, where we have been working with climate scientists discussing how to properly express some of the challenges in climate change. This is the typical plot that people would show to show the increasing temperature over time, which though create a lot of critics in terms of, well, what's the cause? This just shows temperature going up, and people were claiming, well, is that from our activity? It could be solar activity that irradiate more towards the Earth. So we have been looking at analyzing data, in a somewhat better way, but in a finer scale than just this global summary. And so doing this will require churning over and over tens of terabytes of data, down to looking at this kind of averages of temperature at the different layers. And here, for example, you see that, so here the plots, the white is unchanged temperature, red is getting warmer, or blue gets in cooler. And you see actually that the top layer of the atmosphere is cooling down, it's not warming. It's just that the overall average is hotter. So this really, for example, quickly and obviously dispel the notion that this could be the sun radiating from the outside in. And so having the proper analysis and presentation of the data. More importantly, you see that, I mean, this might be projected in 2100, and so you might not believe the simulation, but this is 2000. This is just historical data. This is already there. So you have a signature there. It makes it very clear that this is a trend, and it's going a certain direction, and you cannot dispel it in a certain way. So beyond the specific is like how you analyze and extract information at the level that people can actually use it and rely it is very important. But really this requires to deal with massive amount of data. So this was another example where people were talking about material science. And they used to be, so those are tests done at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, I think in collaboration with IBM. And basically we're looking at cracks in particular materials. They were doing kind of a massive parallel simulation, first principle. So consider kind of exact, except that they were thinking the speed of cracks in materials is limited by the speed of sound in that material. That was kind of the assumption. And this would be the case. So this is a crack that goes exactly at the speed of sound. And now this was another simulation with different conditions. It's like, oh, this is getting faster. And this was, again, emerging after you go through, analyze, summarize. from all these numbers. And now how do you go about it? It's just a simulation. Did we discover something, or it's a mistake? Fortunately, in this case, it turned out that a couple of years later, some experimental evidence showed that this was actually possible. So through simulation, they found something that was not known before. But as long as it's only simulation, it creates a big problem. Is that really true? How do you know that that's true? What if this experiment was not possible? That would have been true anyway, but you couldn't check it. So this creates I mean, on one side, obviously, is a big opportunity, but it's a big challenge of how to deal with the information that you extract from these massive simulations and data sets. And so in this sense, this is kind of opening great opportunities to deal with things like energy. This obviously has a huge impact in the future, massive multi-scale problem where you have to deal with chemistry level and time scales all the way to full devices and system, or even kind of how to extract or generate fuel from different sources, and how do we deal with dealing this. So collecting and processing massive data can make a huge difference in spaces like this, or study the universe, its origin, and so on. So we definitely have the potential of tackle problems like this, or even more personalized medicine. This would be amazing, and this is people already pushing this. You can go down to, take the DNA of a person, and can we understand why a particular disease is affecting one person or another, or can I develop a drug that really works for your case and your disease and your person and not in general. This will make a huge impact, obviously, in society. But how do we do this systematically and well? And so I want to step back 1 second and talk about a guy that ended up in jail. So I don't know if his credibility is strong or not. His name is Galileo Galilei, 1564, 1642. Some of you may know, so he ended up in jail because he was an heretic. Fortunately, the Catholic Church will quickly review his case, and in 1992, actually, they gave the excuses. I don't know if you follow this. And now, so how he impacted science? I mean, he was one of the people at the center of this revolution of defining systematically the approach of the scientific method. It's how we made progress for a long time. So you look at making observations, formulate hypotheses, design an experiment that tests the hypothesis, analyze the outcome, and if necessarily, maybe adjust things and iterate until you converge to something where you really end up to an experiment that everybody can repeat systematically. You have established very well how that works. And in some sense, that's how you know that your hypothesis is true. And I don't believe it just because someone famous say it. I can go and do my test myself. And this kind of was really based, this process on invention, in that case, of a device, was the telescope. So Galileo could tell you the trajectory of a certain star and how they would move it. That's why he ended up being an heretic, thinking that the Earth goes around the sun and not vice versa. But anyway, so you wouldn't have to believe him. You just get your own telescope and observe things yourself, and you know what's true and what's not. And this evolved a little bit more recently into now building theoretical models. So in some sense, it's like how to make your hypothesis better funded in terms of mathematical models. And obviously, we use them heavily even today, so that where you really build these models that are they're way predicted way more than they initially were built for. But continuously, we go back to the empirical evidence to verify if they're actually true or not. So now today, things are changing in a number of instances. For example, devices like this, the LSST, is really meant to go out and brute force collect as much data as possible. And it's not that someone's going to say, well, OK, I want to follow the moon, and this is going to go out and point to the moon. They're just going to go around and survey the sky. And there is kind of a strong faith that later on you go mine the data, extract features, follow that over time, and you will find lots of stuff. But this really turns upside down the process. It's not that you're collecting data based on a scientific hypothesis. Your hypothesis is that, well, let's go and collect as much as possible. Obviously, this will live or die around the issue whether we're going to be able to manage and deliver and process this data properly. But we kind of know that that's true. And this is really happening actually on many, many different scales. I mean, even an environment like online, PayPal, we're talking about millions of logins, transactions, and so on. Those are all being logged. You have this massive data being collected, and people are going to mine it and trying to understand, say, how people behave. And climate is obviously another nice example, massive simulation, massive data collection. A major effort is actually in building those repositories where you have petabytes and petabytes of data already getting bigger and bigger. And by comparing them, doing statistics and so on, increasing their accuracy, there is expectation that we do better. Google is another obvious example. Here we're talking about 6 billion searches per day that were being logged, and now like year after year. And that will give a great picture of what people are interested in. And there is an interesting fact that, I mean, it's not obvious at all that this can be something that you can represent as a mathematical model, but we have the data that express it somehow. Is this meaningful? So generally, this has been kind of the first and second paradigm has been like kind of the initial empirical evidence base and then the theoretical approach. And now we're shifting into an environment where some stuff that was said by a statistician becomes more and more true. It's like, be careful, all the models are wrong, some are useful. This is not my saying, it's Box, obviously. It's a great statistician. And this is true. I mean, put the stuff in perspective in fact, some people more recently start discussing whether you need a model at all. It's like, I really don't subscribe to this point of view, but there is a tendency there is that really you want to start thinking of if I have some correlation in the data and I'm predictive in the way I can express things, it doesn't matter whether I really have my mathematical model behind. So this is kind of the foundation a lot of the third and more important, the fourth paradigm where you have this massive simulation to keep creating more data and more experiment-like structures, but they really come out of our own simulations that often we don't fully understand. And then just like LSST, massive data collections that based on the notion that, OK, we'll extract data from there. Obviously, the opportunities are amazing. For example, and you want to look at how do we do those. Like, I don't know if you read in the news, the Milky Way is crashing into the Andromeda. So can we predict and empirically test how this is going to go? So can we play with a bunch of universes and test how this happens? And fortunately, this is going to take about 4 billion years. So yeah, if you get it wrong, no, not too bad, right? So we're not that worried about it. When you start talking about global warming, right, this is going to affect, like the time scale we're concerned about is 100 years, right? So, and more important, yes, maybe we don't need to change what we do tomorrow morning, but this is going to affect very soon everything potentially. And having the right information, the right quality of data and so on is extremely important, and it's extremely sensitive because it's going to affect politics and the way kind of we do our things. But there are areas where, in some sense, we dealt with this for a long time. I mean, when you do your investment and look at the stock market and hope that your pension plan will go up, how do you deal with that, right? Can you test it empirically? You know, we only have one world economy. You try to build the best models, but you cannot test alternatives and maybe go back and reinvest in a better set. You just have to do it once and hope. And unfortunately, this you start being a timescale that affects personally you very soon, and how long you have to work or how soon can you retire. And there are other things like aging of materials, something that is very nonlinear and difficult to predict. How do we deal with that? For example, for a material like the plutonium, has been discovered only 1914. So for all intents and purposes, has been around for what we know, like less than 100 years, mostly built artificially. How do we know how that's going to age over 100 years, longer than we even know that material? And generally, it's like, you might want to think about it. If we build a rocket and it's all built by data collection, simulation, and so on, are you planning to sit on that rocket and fly up? Would you do it? I'll give you a free ticket. So this is, for example, a case of a rocket, the Ariane 5. This is actually in 1996. Oops. Blew up. $37 million project in 96 that was wasted in 37 seconds. So what is the rate of 10 million per second? And you know what was, anybody knows the cause of this?
Yeah, metric and imperial system, no? Or bug?
A software bug. Yes. So it was, they recycled a subroutine out of the Ariane 4. So it was not that far-fetched. It's just a number they changed there, except that was the routine guiding the rocket, and the new needed the floats instead of integers. And but then they figured that the numbers would be small enough that would not matter. Well, it did matter. That's what happened. But I mean, we do this all the time with our simulation and with the predictions, and so and certainly they didn't do it lightly. And so we can do better, but if you go back to the plutonium example, right, there are big bombs in the, here in the US. Because of the treaties, they're not being tested. They're just running simulations to check what they think, what's going to happen. So I know that the defense is worried that if you launch them, will they explode? But the bigger question is, will they explode before you launch them, right? So we have a material that is aging in the silos, and we don't know what the aging to this new material is going to do. It's an important question. In fact, this was kind of the question, one of the big questions behind kind of the start of the HPC race. If you go through the top machine, there are many like this that were in defense labs, even still today, because they needed to do high quality simulations, and there is a big question whether that's good enough. So this has been the big trend in the performance of HPC machine. This is the top machine. This is collectively the top 500. This was the bottom one. There was actually a clear trend overall of the whole industry, not just a few places. So in some sense, that's a nice, healthy log scale curve. And lots of you are learning about this during this school. And there is a question of, so how do we use it properly in the management of information and data? So obviously, in many cases, data, it's a key aspect in doing scientific analysis and investigation. One important issue is that, unfortunately, if you don't build the data, you basically don't have an opportunity to ask the right question and then give the answer. And I really stress the fact that even formulating the questions, really, it's the outcome of having all that information available. It's even hard to ask the question in the first place. But the downside, unfortunately, is that even if you build all the data, you're not guaranteed at all to get the answer. You still have a big challenge of how to do it. But at least probably you have a great opportunity to actually doing it. So if you don't have the images out of the LST, you will now see certain things. So, but that's why HPC and scientific computing, data analysis, exploration, and so on, those are really important things that we really have to bring up the scale of this massive data. So there are a few things that we've done, and actually interesting, many are based here in Argonne. So this was a case where scientists were used the advanced photon source here. The scientists were actually PNNL. They needed to run the experiment and check the results right away. So streaming the data on the fly, make them look at this, was key to actually make sure that they would use the facility effectively. Previously, they would just go back days later with all the data and often find out that they wasted time because they couldn't adjust their parameters right away. So having data services that move the data right away, it's actually in these areas very important. So those are cases where, for example, we allow climate simulations, put the data online, and then scientists can go in and kind of stream immediately, resample data, comparing simulations that are run from different models in different countries, compare them, look at statistical variations. I don't know if you know, most of the time the individual simulations are not that meaningful. We really want to look at ensembles. But then moving all the data locally and doing those things is just cumbersome and very often leads to not doing things in practice. So we build out tools like this. I'll do a 10-second demo where, for example, here we have a data set that is single volume, is about 6.4 terabytes, streaming on the Wi-Fi here in real time, and then you can start looking at the data and do kind of interaction processing and so on the fly. And obviously, I don't have the 6 terabyte. It would take a little bit longer if I had to move the data on my laptop and actually do it. So there are ways, and obviously we have to push the boundaries of this work to do these things. This is something that, for example, some of the library we built for dealing with data movement and I/O, we've been pushing hard to scale them, say, from iPhone all the way to 100,000+ cores on machine. Actually, my mirror here is one of the latest. And for example, showing that you go to the supercomputing floor and you can look in real time on data stored here in Argonne and explore it even in 3D immersively, and effectively do the work that a scientist should be doing in his office. And you deal with this interactivity even when the data is very large. Now, even if I'm personally really focused on interactivity, when you deal with this large data, you want to be open-minded and do things the other way. There is an interesting use case that was based on Geico. They needed to people call, say, oh, this is my car, family member, blah, 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 how much is going to cost? And they couldn't compute fast enough the best quote they could give you. So what they did is actually every weekend they would pre-compute all the quotes for all the possible families in the US. And it works. And if it works, why not? And so, although I'm one of the people who really focus on doing things on the fly, blah, 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 you really have to look at case by case and look at those solutions. And this was actually very interesting to look at, kind of refreshing. I didn't think that you could actually pull it off that way. So, but generally, this is the type of infrastructure that has to be built, that you really have to build the data, curate it, collect it, and make it available. But then how do you build knowledge and actionable information from that? It's an important question. So that's why recently, for example, uncertainty quantification and verification and validation has become major trends and important areas to explore. And the question is, obviously it's important, how much is really just admitting that you have a problem versus an actual solution. So for things like UQ, we have been looking at, so when I have a family simulations, like this one, designing a fuel, this, I don't know, for those of you that know Jackie Chan, she's running these massive combustion simulations. They're trying different fuels. And this is the 10-dimensional space of all possible, I mean, obviously sampled, all possible simulation. This would be a single point in this space based on different input parameters. And they want to look at which one is best. So high value here is high temperature, good combustion. This high hill in this 10-dimensional terrain is good news. Those three valleys, again, think of a 10-dimensional terrain, are actually bad combustions that you want to avoid. And generally, though, there is a general question of this landscape, how many hills and valleys will have. The good news is this is relatively simple. In fact, two of those valleys they knew already. Here you have all oxidizer, no fuel. It will not burn. Here's the dual situation, all fuel, no oxidizer, no burning. This guy here was really bad news because actually this is the right combination of oxidizer and fuel, except that the exhaust generated by the combustion is putting out the flames anyway. And so this situation is actually tough, and in the design of the fuel and the device that burns, it's very important to make sure that you are up here and down here. And also we did some, so this is out of topological analysis, statistic around this halo that you see means how flat is the top of your hill. So this is actually relatively stable because it's like a plateau. Those are narrow. Unfortunately, I don't know if you can see, this is somewhat large, so this valley is really nasty. But the good news is only one. They didn't know there could be many of those that you're trying to avoid. So this is stuff that you want to think. Or here was a case of designing a particular material. Those are the components. These are experiments done at PNNL. And again, each point here is building a material with certain composition, running through a system and checking its quote-unquote performance. Again, so high value, again, are good things. And now it turns out there are three ways of building a good material and one major large way of doing poorly. And now the interesting part here now, palladium is in the platinum family. It's the expensive one. So then you pick which of those hills you want to be based on which one uses the least amount of palladium. But more importantly, in a challenging process like this, where actually every was like a dozen about tests they could do once in a month, and they're very expensive. You can start planning them carefully by placing those points in this landscape carefully so that you maximize the information you get out of it and you minimize the uncertainty in your outcome. But when you go to things like verification, which is really the question of are we building the software right, which is probably a lot of the things we discuss here, or is my software without any bug? I mean, in my mind, this is really something that unless you see this animal, you will not see the bug-free software, and we see the consequences of that. But the even bigger question is validation. Is the process that you're designing provides accurate predictions, right? And this is the most difficult part in terms of violating the scientific method. We can only check one, in some sense, one experiment over time. We cannot design a bunch and test them. In fact, thinking about the parallel of the economy, the Security Exchange Commission requires funds to write past performance that not necessarily predict future results. So people that dealt with this mode of having just one thing over time know very well that this is the wrong safe to have. That since something has been working so far, it will work. Okay, continue to work. One of my examples that last year I sent 2 of my students here, and they really were happy about it. And this year they both got a supercomputing paper. So should I derive the, now everybody here will get at the next supercomputing a paper accepted and being the first author. Well, I hope that's true.
You don't have enough data.
I don't know. Is that, I'm sure if you ask Paul, he'd say, no, past performance is a good predictor. But in a way, I mean, yeah, if that's my only data point, can I make that prediction? But then there are other aspects, and I'll wrap up in a minute. Like when we look at this massive model, you really want to look at massively multi-scale phenomena. And for example, in terms of dealing with the data, classical multi-resolution, wavelet-like techniques, and so on, they really tend to run out of steam too soon. And if you start averaging, you really lose the information. You really want to have a process that is much more the human mind. When you look at something, you isolate, extract features, and then in a few bytes, you express a very complex concept without having to do a lot of, so you really preserve abstract information. So this is something that, for example, we try to do with topological methods where you can take a smooth continuous field and turning into a vector representation on simple skeletons and multiple scales. So this is a massive data reduction, and it's closer to what you might want to normally think about in terms of the model. And it's done automatically because a purely mathematical approach is not specialized to a particular application. Or when you look at phenomena over time, you might extract features, follow them, and then look in spaces like this where, yeah, this is an event in a particular time step, and then you look at automatically how things split, merge, and so on. And despite the fact that my experience is that users don't like to look at graph, building graph-like abstraction seems to be an important approach into building multi-scale models that work in practice. So in that sense, we've seen topology to work very well, for example, to complement statistical methods and other things. But I think there we need to find other techniques as well that will even complement those. And to conclude, a last point is that we kind of are closing a vicious cycle where the machines that we're using to tackle those problems are becoming so complicated that dealing with them in turn is a big data problem. If you start looking at all the logs and memory hierarchies and network connections and I/O structures, and even the dimensions now, power consumption and so on, and all the information that comes out of the machines that can characterize if a code is running fast or multiple codes on the same machine are clashing into each other, is very, very hard to explore that information, again, gain actionable information out of it. And so actually recently we have been focusing on performance analysis and information visualization techniques. So to have things like this is actually a 3D torus unroll on a plane so that people can look at network without having kind of occlusion like this that does not allow you to look at the actual information. And we had we're building a community. We had a Dutch tool workshop in January. We have a workshop at the end of supercomputing this year. I really hope people will attend. But generally, this is an important space to work on. So to conclude, really, I see this great opportunity, but great challenge in having a problem that are so large where we really also have institutions that are different in nature, work more and more in collaboration to leverage their strengths. I see a big challenge in changing and improving the educational approaches in this space. I think we need to learn not just the technical aspects, but how do we work in a team? And I've seen typically the problem that people across community try to talk about tasks and instead of sharing real problems. And that's a major obstacle in terms of exploiting each other's strengths. And overall, we see this amazing opportunity to do new scientific discoveries and engineering innovations. Computer science, I think, can play a central role in this, just because a lot of this is computational. But then interdisciplinary collaboration remains a challenge because they have to collaborate with other disciplines as equal peers. And overall, we have this, I think, this amazing opportunity to build a new telescope to do the next revolution and kind of look at what's going to be the new scientific method. And I thank you for your attention.
Time for a question or two for Valerio, if there are any.
Yes.
Just note the difference between the two pictures. Galileo, the old guy, is showing the young guy what to see. The other picture is probably the young hacker showing the.
Yes, I think that's exactly the right perspective. Yes.
I'm just curious about like the challenge of big data when you can think that is it really possible for any one organization or place to be a clearinghouse for the data about something? So then it lends itself to that this data has to be hosted in multiple locations and people need to agree on some type of format or way of accessing it or some type of interface. Do you have any?
So I have two comments. On one side, it's a very seductive idea to have agree on a standard and unify and so on. The other, though, that I've seen over and over, that as soon as you do that, you stifle innovation. You establish a standard, people have to follow that, and then as soon as you do better, you're out of the loop and you cannot inject that. So, plus I'm kind of anarchic in nature, so I really don't like fixed structures. So I really think one has to have still a highly dynamic environment, and that will, I think, will happen naturally, but when this will not be, in some sense, such of a big deal. So the major obstacle will be resolved, and then things will be ready for that stage. But trying to do it too early, I think it will be a problem more than a solution.
Thank you. Well, let's thank Valerio again.
Thanks.